Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Hyman, and I am excited to welcome you today to the most recent quarterly Human Trafficking Prevention Project webinar. I'm very excited to be here today with the Human Trafficking Prevention Project Director, Jessica Emerson, and then our special guest presenters today, Melanie Shapiro, who is the Policy Director at Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, and Amanda Rodriguez, the Executive Director at Turnaround, Inc. for our discussion today. I'm unfortunately getting over COVID, so I'm not going to be talking much. I'm going to hand things over to Jess to moderate the rest of our discussion. But just a few housekeeping notes before we jump in to this. I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion. We are recording this webinar and closed captioning is on, as you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. We will be monitoring the chat for questions, so please do feel free to jump in with any questions, comments you might have throughout. We'd love for this to be more of a discussion than a lecture. So, and with that, I will hand it off to Jess so we can dive right in.
Great. Thank you, Heather. We're glad that you are on the mend, but we're happy to kind of take the reins on this while you get over it. Can you unshare? So that
yes, I'm going to
see more than
stop
just
my
you and
sharing.
I. There we go. Okay, great. Again, my name is Jessica Emerson. I direct the Human Trafficking Prevention Project and am an amateur policy person in the anti-trafficking space. Before we get into the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force and some of the legislative priorities, and then kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the unintended consequences, I was hoping to have the both of you give us a little bit more information on yourselves. If you can introduce yourself, your current position and what that entails-ish, the role of policy in your work, and how you began doing policy work. How did you get to the point that you are, the two of you are the co-chairs of the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force's Legislative Subcommittee? So Amanda, I see you are unmuted, so I'm going to you first.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jessica and Heather, for having me today. As Heather mentioned, I am the Executive Director of Turnaround, which is the Rape Crisis Center for Baltimore County and City. And we also are a comprehensive provider for human trafficking survivors here in Baltimore. So I actually kind of came to anti-trafficking policy in this super roundabout way. I was a prosecutor in Baltimore County and was one of the very early participants on the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force, long before there was a lot of inclusion in policy work on the task force. And I think I actually got into policy because they wanted a lawyer in the legislative group. The folks that were working on policy at the very early, like the early stages, were not lawyers. And so they wanted somebody that had a legal brain, although just because you're a lawyer doesn't necessarily mean that you're good at policy, and you don't need to be a lawyer to be good at policy. And so that's really how I got started. And then I absolutely fell in love with policy. It is a wonderful area and a real way to make a difference in a global sense. And in my work now, because I've really, since 2009, I've been doing this policy work in the anti-trafficking field. And I've had stints where all that I did was policy. Actually, I had two different jobs in which I did just policy work. Now I get to do it as part of being an executive director, which means I get to run an agency. And then also in my spare time, I also do policy work, which is a lot of fun because you get to, I firmly believe that you have to understand the work to be able to do good policy. You have to understand really the impact of the policy on the clients themselves or the survivors themselves and the people that are doing the work. The folks that are day to day making the decisions in terms of how they're going to show up for survivors to effectuate good policy. So I feel like I get to bring that, and yeah, I love this work. I think it is fantastic, and I love that we're talking about it today. So thank you all again.
Great. Melanie.
Thank you. And also thank you for having me today. As you said, I'm currently the Public Policy Director with the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. We are the State Domestic Violence Coalition, and one of our member programs is, in fact, Turnaround. which Amanda is the executive director on. I came to this work as a public defender specializing in juvenile defense. I did that for a number of years in New York, where early on, one of my first cases was a young child who was being trafficked. She was in a group home at the time and was being trafficked by one of the employees actually of the group home. And that was my very first case representing a child victim of trafficking. And I was practicing in Queens at the time, and there was unfortunately a lot of cases and instances of child trafficking, and they were arresting children and charging them with prostitution. So I represented a number of those children, and then had the opportunity to work on the first safe harbor law that ever passed in this country with Jessica in New York, and travel to Albany with child survivors to meet with legislators and advocate for its passage. When I returned to Maryland, I worked in the Baltimore City Juvenile Division and saw what trafficking looked like in Maryland. And in fact, the first child victim of trafficking from Maryland that I represented was in Manhattan. She had been trafficked to the city and was being trafficked there. And then had an opportunity in my role as chief of the Baltimore City Juvenile Division. I often testified on juvenile related bills and became involved in the Safe Harbor Work Group, where I got to work with some of the fine people on this webinar, and then joined the government relations team of the Public Defender's Office full time, and now joined the network almost 2 years ago. And I agree tremendously with Amanda that having the perspective of working directly with impacted persons, and then gives a different perspective, an important perspective that I think makes me better at doing my job, just because I have an understanding and having that connection. I don't do direct representation right now, but I can draw on those experiences as we advocate for more reforms that are needed in Maryland.
Great. The theme that I heard you both share is that, you know, we do the direct practice, we work directly with impacted individuals in whatever capacity we're working, but that an important part of doing any kind of advocacy work for individuals who are impacted by crime, a big piece of that is working on the systemic challenges as opposed to those kind of individual cases, because, you know, and I can second that, and I know Heather can third it, that even if you do your best work on the direct practice, in the direct practice world, you're going to butt heads with systemic challenges, many of which can be impacted positively, or at least have the harm reduced by doing legislative advocacy. So it sounds like that is something that the two of you prioritize, and I know Heather and I do as well. Excellent. All right. So Amanda, you referenced being involved with the task force back before 2010. So for those individuals who are listening in who maybe don't know a lot about the task force, can you talk a little bit about when, how, and why the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force formed, as well as its current structure, so that folks kind of know what's happening in the anti-trafficking world in Maryland?
Sure. So the task force got started in 2007, and it came out of kind of two places. So one, Maryland did not have a law criminalizing on the state side human trafficking until 2007. So there were advocates in the Maryland legislature and lobbyists that came up with and championed the passage of this law that criminalized that activity. And we can have a whole conversation about how that law came to be and the problems with that law, but we'll save that for another day, another time. But at the same time, the U.S. Attorney's Office in a variety of jurisdictions also were championing the coming together of task forces. And so the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Baltimore put together a task force and pulled together both local government entities, local NGOs, local law enforcement entities to start working in collaboration to look at trafficking efforts. At its inception, it was relatively small. And so we looked at the state police, the local law enforcement that wanted to get involved. So it depended on how many jurisdictions at the time. I think it was Baltimore County, I want to say Montgomery County, Anne Arundel County were all involved in the inception in terms of right when it started, that Baltimore U.S. Attorney's Office's task force, the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force. And there really weren't that many NGOs because at the time, nobody was assisting on that effort. There was no victim service because nobody had identified human trafficking yet as something. We weren't funding it, so there wasn't a victim service agency that could support human trafficking survivors at the time.
It wasn't a crime.
Exactly.
Who's doing the work?
Exactly. So that changed relatively quickly. People did come and they did meet the need really quickly as soon as the crime had been identified. And I want to be clear, there were other people that were meeting the need. They just didn't have a label on it yet, right? And so the task force did come together and it grew relatively quickly as well. There were, I think at the beginning, it was just a handful of people, a handful of groups. And within a couple of years, it was much bigger. And now it is a relatively large task force. There are well more than I think 50 or 60 member groups that belong to the task force. Right now, we have 5 different committees. So it's public awareness, legislative. Those are both open committees and anyone can join them and sit on them and participate in them. And then there are closed committees, so training, victim services, and law enforcement. So obviously you have to be a law enforcement agent to be on law enforcement committee, victim service committee. You have to be a victim service agency or represent one. And then training, you have to be a part of a training group or belong to another entity that would be an expert in training. And all of those groups are very active and we participate. I mean, even as of October, there's going to be a huge conglomerate of us that go and train both in the public sphere and the private sphere to ensure that, we are doing the very best that we can in Maryland and coordinating as best we can to serve our Maryland constituents, to identify and to provide services to survivors of trafficking.
Great, thank you. I noticed that you said in Maryland, as is typical around the country, state-based human trafficking task forces tend to be, not all of them, the majority around the country tend to be rooted in a law enforcement response. And we'll talk about how some of that can be challenging. But I kind of want to stick with this, HT Task Force 101 piece. And Melanie, you have a lot of experience working on legislative policy initiatives for larger organizations that can get a little wily. There are a lot of kind of pieces to the puzzle. And I think as someone who has been a part of the legislative task force since I think, 2013, 2014, I can definitely attest to the fact that it is sometimes like herding cats in order to do this legislative work. But there was a big change made in terms of how to organize things with regard to legislative priorities for the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force. So can you talk a little bit about how, and sorry, it goes dark, there's a light that's motion sensed in front of me, but it doesn't like my motion unless I actually leave the office. So I'm not going to get up and do that. So can you talk about how the legislative subcommittee is structured, kind of the way that policy positions are introduced, arrived upon, and just the current structure of things, and then we'll go into, what are the actual policy positions of the task force.
Sure. So, and Amanda, feel free to jump in, and Jess as well, because I believe you were a previous chair of the legislative subcommittee. But it's a great group of different professionals who come together and survivors who come together. And historically, we have reviewed different bills as they've been introduced and take a vote about whether or not we want to take a position. And then that is reviewed by the steering committee, maybe. in terms of our ability to actually weigh in on the legislation. There have been in years past bills that we've taken a leadership role on, which brings us to what we're doing now, which is trying to sort of formalize and provide a little bit more structure to the process. So obviously there's always going to be during session legislation, some that we know about, some that we don't know about that's introduced that we want to weigh in on. And so we'll continue that process. But we've created, we had a retreat over the summer, which was great. We were in person and all came together and discussed this past legislative session, and also looking forward to, you know, sort of what we want to see in Maryland to benefit survivors of trafficking. And so we divided up into, we are a subcommittee, but we have 3 subcommittees within the subcommittee. So maybe we need a different name.
Subcommittees. Yeah, that's
so we divided into 3 subcommittees. All members of the subcommittee were invited to participate in all of them, and different people with different subject matter expertise are joining and participating to look forward to this coming year and what legislation we want to work on. It feels really good to have some identified priority areas and to be more proactive than reactive.
excellent. Yeah, 'cause anyone who has done policy anywhere knows that in the moment when session starts, you are off to the races. And I think that through no fault of anyone's, it can feel like you're always playing catch up. And so what I'm hearing is that the decision, I'm acting like I wasn't involved in those decisions, but I'm trying to pretend as though I was not. Clearly, the attempt is being made to kind of lessen some of the hysteria that can come with in session decisions about who's the point person, this, that, and the third. So while I want to get into the 2023 legislative priorities, Amanda, as someone who has been doing this policy work a lot longer than anyone else here, well, the HT stuff a lot longer than anyone here, can you talk about a couple of, in your opinion, highlights of legislative sessions past, in terms of what the task force has spearheaded, what you view as some real legislative victories that you started when you introduced yourself, saying that in 2007, the task, well, I don't think it was the task force, but people who are now the task force members and some of our legislative partners individually came together to actually pass legislation criminalizing trafficking. So can we start there and maybe give us some highlights? And if you skip vacature, you know I'm going to be mad.
I know, I wrote it down, Jess. I wrote it down, vacature, and I underlined it so I wouldn't forget. I mean, yeah, I can't imagine. I wasn't there. So, I actually had not passed the bar in 2007. So I can't imagine what it must have been like to be there and the work that must have been done leading up. Now having tried to pass Safe Harbor for 8 years to actually get people's heads around the idea of human trafficking, bar none. Now at that point, I will put out there, it was named human trafficking. It was only sex trafficking. But I think that in itself is a huge victory for the issue and for the movement. And the other thing that I'll highlight is that there was also kind of a lacking or a sticking point because it didn't quite address child sex trafficking in the way that it should have, and that happened later. So another huge victory when that happened, and we were addressing child sex trafficking in the way that it should have and felonized things in the way that it should have. I should change that language a little bit, not felonizing the way that it should have, that we finally addressed and felonized child sex trafficking.
Well, and it is important, even though I'm, of course, am going to kind of levy some criticism around the focus on prosecution, but that is indeed how the work started, was identifying that a crime was being committed. And as a result, the first step to acknowledging that people needed services was that you had to have something that someone was doing that was against the law.
Absolutely.
And so there was that initial 2007 law, then there was, like you said, something very specific around the trafficking of individuals under the age of 18
Correct.
followed shortly after.
And then the next thing, and it doesn't seem like a big thing, and I know that there was no teeth attached to it, but I remember what a victory it was at the time was around posting laws. So there was a series of posting laws that came after that. And again, it was this acknowledgement that there were these things that were going on and we needed to get it into the public sphere for identification. So it was this idea of the crime next door, that we could get the public engaged and involved with identification, and the public needed to be aware that this was happening and that they could be a part of the solution. So it was, when we start talking about system level change and stigma changing, that was really an important part of the movement as well. The next one that I have is vacatur, which was, again, we're talking about system level change and society changing, mind changing. We need to start thinking about criminalization, over criminalization, and how that played a part and plays a huge role in this issue and leading to vulnerabilities overall. And so we start talking about that in a very different way as soon as vacatur came to the table. And Maryland was one of the first. And I think that is a really important part of the conversation.
And just to let our listeners know, Maryland, if we're talking about those specific legislative victories, the TVPA was only passed in 2000. The last state that actually passed an anti-trafficking law, I think, was like 2017. So Maryland was at the beginning of passing laws, kind of identifying what trafficking is and criminalizing it. Second in the country to recognize that victims are also being criminalized.
Right.
I know that we've had some frustrations around, like, you know, we need to move on from a baseline understanding of these things, and modernizing some of these statutes has been challenging. But Maryland really has been at the forefront in addressing these issues as they came into the public consciousness.
For sure, for sure. So what happened next was there was actually a federal swing toward child sex trafficking, and you see that in our legislation as well. So one of the big ones was around mandated reporting, and then we had to fix mandated reporting. So we identified it, we got that onto the books, but then we also had to look at fixing some of the issues that came along with that, to say that yes, if your parent was the one trafficking you, they in fact did count, or if it wasn't your parent, they in fact did count, and we still had to call that case in, and that still would be a case for DSS.
And by mandated reporting, you mean acknowledging that child sex trafficking is abuse.
Correct. So that this was in fact sexual abuse, and that we had to call DSS, and we needed to identify that child. Yes. So there was then a pause, actually, in terms of serious or significant legislation that passed. And then we get to 2018, 2019, and we see another flurry of and pretty significant years in terms of legislation. The one that I'm proud of, and I was involved in the passage of it, was labor trafficking. So what I said was 2007 essentially was sex trafficking that passed. 2019, we finally got labor trafficking passed and made that a crime. And then that was the same year as the Regional Navigator Program, which, again, first step in our safe harbor law to get that through. And we then had another victory for vacatur. Some expansion happened after that. And now we're sitting here today. And so I do think that we're in a place, to your point, of modernization. But we have had some pretty significant victories, and we're hopefully slated to have some more.
Great, thank you. Melanie, can you talk to us about the task force's priorities in this past legislative session? Any successes that happened, any challenges that remain? And I think that will probably very effectively lead us into the 2023 legislative priorities.
Sure. So I would say that we didn't go through the same type of formal process identifying priorities in advance of last year's legislative session, but safe harbor was clearly our number one priority. There were some other bills that we worked on, but passing safe harbor had been our primary goal. And unfortunately, the bill got very close to passage, but on the last day of the legislative session, with just a few minutes left on the clock, the bill did not pass. And so we'll be back this year. There are a number of other bills that we did weigh in on as a task force, some of which will be beneficial to victims and survivors of trafficking. The Innkeepers Bill, which will require hotels, motels to keep electronic databases of those staying there and keep those records for 6 months. There's also a training component as well. That bill had been around for a number of years and did pass this past session. Another bill that passed allows for temporary orders of protection to be petitioned virtually. This only applies to temporary orders of protection, but you can go to a domestic violence, sex assault, human trafficking program, a hospital, or any other place approved by the court and petition for the temporary protective order and have that hearing heard virtually. That law goes into effect October 1. The definition of stalking was expanded to include electronic surveillance. So updating the law to reflect what current practice is. And one of the significant factors in that is you are eligible for a protective order if you are being stalked. And previously it was not part of the definition of stalking. One other bill that passed was there was what we call a sunset, or a law that was going to end by a certain date, and that sunset was repealed, and so the law is in effect that if you are a victim of a sexual assault and you are prescribed NPEP, that is going to be covered. It does not, insurance does not need to be used for that. That will be provided.
And again, I don't want to make any assumptions about who's listening in, but can you tell us what NPEP is?
It is a prophylactic treatment for post-exposure for HIV. Okay. And so obviously very significant. The title of the bill was Program for Preventing HIV Infection for Rape Victims, Alterations and Repeal of Sunset. Okay. And so that bill passed. There were a number of other bills that we did also support and unfortunately did not pass. Safe Harbor obviously being one of them. Another piece of legislation, and we'll talk about it a little bit, is regarding education surrounding trafficking in schools. There was a bill that would have made some necessary technical changes to the vacatur process. And that did not pass. And then one final bill was surrounding body-worn cameras and their ability to be, so trying to limit their release to the general public outside of court proceedings for victims, certain victims of, for example, sexual assault and domestic violence. So we have a lot of work that will come up this session, but are, certainly made during the I guess it was the 2022 session.
Thank you for that. Before we go into Safe Harbor, because I know that is has been the never-ending story of legislation that look at Amanda's face that the task force has tried to pass. For our listeners, for those who maybe haven't been immersed in this world, I mean, I only counted one quote unquote anti-trafficking bill in the bunch, right? You talked about a stalking law, you talked about around laws around protective orders. And it sounds like, well, I don't want to say it sounds like, it clearly is important to, those of us who are doing this work, to recognize the intersections between trafficking and other forms of violence against people. Melanie, can you talk a little bit about why establishing and maintaining partnerships across types of crime and across issues is so important in anti-trafficking work, and not just in anti-trafficking work, in all of the other types? Because that's really something, Amanda, we did not do for so many years. It was just anti-trafficking bills. And now it's nice to see that, yeah, there are anti-trafficking bills, but there are far more intersectional legislative opportunities and just why that is something that is crucial in the work, or why you think it's crucial in the work.
Sure. So just from a general policy perspective, I think it's important that people understand, especially legislators, how a particular bill or law would impact various groups of individuals. And so if it's going to impact, the intersection between domestic violence and human trafficking, we know that overwhelming number of traffickers are in fact either intimate partners or other relatives. And so you can't look at each of them in silos because the work itself intersects, right? And so we talk about domestic violence, we talk about sexual assault, and we talk about trafficking. And in reality, there are elements of each of them. And we can also look at some of it in a broader framework of power-based violence and the general and common themes that intersect. Also, it's sometimes stronger. Each of our independent groups are not necessarily as large as when we work together, and you're more powerful when you have various groups advocating on behalf of, or sometimes against, different policy issue. So I think looking at one particular piece of legislation from various perspectives and having those different groups together is only going to strengthen any one position on it. And you can take a broader framework because historically we've looked at all of these different issues from very specific lens. And now as we are learning more, as research has come out, as we are understanding, I don't know that the word intersectionality is something that was a common word in my vocabulary, maybe even 5 years ago. And now it's something that I probably say every couple of hours, if not more frequently. And so as we learn more, I think it's just important to educate others and highlight, and that working together and informing others about the intersections of the different work makes it more effective in terms of passing legislation.
And we just want to make sure that people are clear on what the term means, and also hold space and honor Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who came up with the term intersectionality. And the best way that I can explain it is one of my favorite quotes by Audre Lorde, which is, "There's no such thing as single issue struggles because we do not live single issue lives." But essentially intersectionality theorizes, and I think we do more than just theorize with it, but it theorizes that depending on people's different identities, their racial identities, their ethnic identities, their socioeconomic identities, their gender or gender identity identities, that people experience different types of oppression based on those identities. And then when those identities combine, as with a Black female, for instance, there is oppression that is race-based and there is oppression that is gender-based. But when those two things combine, that is a separate and unique and more challenging type of oppression in and of itself. So I'm glad to hear you talk about the fact that, thinking through intersectionality and the intersection of these issues is something that is a regular part of your policy work now. Okay, Amanda, safe harbor is obviously priority number one for the task force. For those people who maybe don't know what safe harbor is, can you give a little bit of a historical perspective and talk about where we are in Maryland, or where we are and where we're trying to get in Maryland with safe harbor?
Sure. Goodness, I always struggle with even where to start with safe harbor. So back in 2014, make sure I'm counting correctly, 2014, the state task force decided that we were going to start looking at safe harbor as the issue du jour. So the issue that we wanted to bring forward is a policy issue. And it had been an issue that had been percolating actually nationally for a while. New York had already passed its safe harbor law. And it is an issue that is, honestly, in my opinion, non-controversial, but it does take some education to get us to the place that we can pass it. So because like New York, as an example, the laws were relatively new, we decided to say, let's take a study period. Let's look at what some other states have done. Let's take our time and pass it correctly so that we don't do more harm, especially because we're talking about kids. In that, so we decided to do this before a working group. We got that bill passed. So we created a working group that was legislatively mandated. That working group came together. I think it was supposed to be a year. That turned into a 5-year working group. They just kept sunsetting it. So as Melanie said, it was sunset. The sunset kept coming and we kept saying, no, hold on, pass it again. Because the group could not come to consensus. And there really was either one or sometimes two, usually it was one kind of sticking person or sticking organization that would say, we don't want there to be a non-criminalization or the ability for a child to have immunity related to prior criminal acts or criminal acts committed by that child, even if they were as a result of or direct result of their trafficking. So ultimately we got to the 5-year mark and we decided, you know what, it's just time, we're going to move forward. And we put forward the legislation that was recommended by this working group, which included this provision that a child could not be prosecuted for their own rape, and would include a program for service. So it would create the regional navigator program, which I mentioned before, which would mean that every jurisdiction in Maryland would have a regional navigator that would be required to provide or have a partner that could provide a certain number of services for those kids that were identified. At the time, there were, I think, maybe 5 specialized service providers in Maryland for child victims of trafficking, and they were in the central Maryland region. And so it was if you were identified as a trafficking survivor and you were not in those 5 counties, good luck. Like there was no one for you. There was no specialized services. So we did that. And unfortunately, there was opposition to that bill, and it was staunch opposition. As I mentioned before, I was a state prosecutor. There's my car. I was a state prosecutor, and I have never seen opposition by the Maryland State's Attorneys Association to a bill like that bill. I think both in the state and the Senate, there were 4 state's attorneys that came out in opposition to the bill. And we got to a point where we had to make a decision. What we're going to do? We decided we were going to bifurcate the issues. So we killed off the section related to children being prosecuted for their for crimes related to, or not being prosecuted for crimes related to their trafficking, and we allowed for the grant program creating regional navigators to go forward. One of the arguments that the state's attorneys kept bringing up is that there are these services don't exist in most jurisdictions. So what are we even going to do if we identify these kids? These services don't exist. So we said, well, we'll at least create the programs so when we come back next year, they won't be able to argue that anymore.
And I can say, Amanda, and Melanie, jump in if I'm off base at all. That did happen in New York, because in 2008, the movement around the fact that, like you said, minors who can't consent to either engaging in a commercial sex act or just sex itself were being arrested and prosecuted and jailed for what we now recognize to be a crime. Under both federal and state law, minors cannot engage in a commercial sex act, and so they are considered to be a victim of sex trafficking per se if they are under the age of 18 and trading sex. But what happened in New York was essentially the criminalization mechanism was taken away, and then everybody was like, where do we go? Where's the money? Where's the services? Where's the beds? Where's the stuff? And that was something that we wanted to, back in 2014, 2015, we wanted to make sure that we did not do. And so I know that it was upsetting to kind of see the vitality with which this bill was fought against. But I do see the wisdom now of making sure that this program was in place, even though I don't necessarily think that was the reason for the opposition, but I do now value the opportunity to put the regional navigator program in place prior to addressing the criminalization trigger.
Yeah, for sure. And the same thing happened in DC, honestly. So we're seeing other states go through the same thing that we went through. And now we're in a place where most jurisdictions have a regional navigator. I know that the state recently put out funding to create the additional regional navigators to make sure that the entire state is covered. So we've gone back and forth. We're up to year 8. We're walking into year 8. We're going to approach it this year with a new set of eyes. We got super close last year and we were at sine die. We had a bill that everybody was supportive of, including the Maryland State's Attorneys Association. And I think that this, I don't want to say this is the year, because I said that last year, and I feel like you can't keep saying it over and over and over again. Eventually, you're just going to keep saying it. It's not going to be the year. But I do think that there is enough momentum and enough support that we could, in fact, get something passed. But what I will say is that it's really important to all of us as advocates, and I think it's important to the task force to recognize that this is not a bill that can be watered down. We're at a place that we've waited long enough for something to get passed, that it has to be something that actually addresses the issue. So saying that we're going to pass something that only addresses prostitution when we've waited 8 years to get anything passed, and at this point there are very few children in Maryland that are actually being prosecuted for prostitution because our law enforcement partners have said, well, that is wrong, and we've identified that as something that we don't do just by practice. Like, we're at a place now that that is something that is not actually going to address the issue that we need to address.
Although it does still happen, and it tends to happen more often to LGBTQIA youth.
Correct.
So we are not out of the woods, but you're right. There has been a major policy and practice shift, minus legislation.
Exactly right. So what I'll say is, if we're going to sit here and fight for something at this point, we're going to fight for the thing that actually makes sense. And it's going to be a full-on stigma system level shift. And that requires that we are able to look in the face the survivor sitting across from us that is holding drugs for her trafficker. And when the officer says, well, I can't charge you for prostitution anymore, but I can charge you for the cocaine in your pocket. No, actually you can't, because she's being trafficked, or he's being trafficked, or they're being trafficked. And so I think that we really need to, as advocates, accept that we're in this place. Like, we fought for our 8 years, and now it's time to move the ball forward. So that's where we are. And if you want to join the fight with us, the committee is an open committee, so feel free to reach out.
Thank you. Melanie, can you talk to us about the other 2 primary 2023 legislative priorities for the task force?
Sure, absolutely.
And add anything to the safe harbor discussion?
Yes. The one thing that I wanted to just add at the end, which is that while Maryland should not be proud that it has taken so long to pass safe harbor, we do have the benefit of watching other states and learning from them in terms of what works, what doesn't work, and implementation. And yes, New York's implementation was very bumpy in the beginning. For a while, it was an unfunded mandate. And so while the law was there, the services were not. We don't have that challenge in Maryland. But as Amanda has already said, we can't just look at the charge itself of prostitution. We need to look at all of the related offenses and the things that young people are made to do as they are being victimized by a trafficker, and address those related offenses as well in safe harbor. So some
of which are not actually criminal acts committed in furtherance of the trafficker's goal, but also simply to survive.
Correct. For example, stealing something to eat because that's not
using
being provided
drugs.
to them. Yes. So there's a whole lot of different situations that, having worked directly with child survivors of trafficking, it's difficult to comprehend all that they needed to do to survive. And so as a system, we should be responsive to that. And if we're going to be a trauma-informed system, we need to recognize that and not criminalize them for that.
Melanie, I have a quick question,
Sure.
both for you and Amanda. I know we were going to talk about ways to get involved a little more in depth at the end, but given the time too, I was wondering if, as we go through each of the legislative priorities for this session, if you could just throw out ways that the participants in the webinar, things they might be able to even prepare now or think about it. Is a wider coalition needed supporting the bill? Is are there certain stories you're looking for? I know you've been through this so many years, you know what I mean, and prepared so much to support this legislation, but just any ideas you might be able to throw out to get people thinking before we're in the crunch of the legislative session.
Sure. So initially, what I would suggest is if you want to get directly involved with the task force, to send me, and I can put it in the chat when I'm done talking, my email, or reach out to Amanda. And we can get you added to the email list. And then from there, we share when the subcommittees are meeting. So if there's a particular one you're interested in, you could attend that one. I think social media is important. You could follow any of the groups on social media. The Human Trafficking Task Force does not have social media account that I'm aware of, but I believe Turnaround does, MNADV does, HTPP. Do you do social media? You do social media?
Will soon, but
MVLS is a very active account. And we've
Okay.
been promoting a
And
lot of
so follow people that do work that you're interested in.
I just want to highlight a couple of other partners who are very much involved in social media and putting out their information. MCASA is one, the Women's Law Center is another. Those are organizations that do Maryland Legislative Agenda for Women. Those are some organizations to follow if you are interested in kind of these intersecting issues. And then if you're interested in issues relating to criminal record relief, vacature and things like that, I would definitely get involved or follow Job Opportunities Task Force, Homeless Persons Representation Project, Out for Justice is another. And so there are, I think you're right, Heather, that folks can pay attention to organizations who do, associated work.
And we can send out a list of organizations as well as everyone's contact information. We'll do that to everyone that registered for the webinar.
Yes. And I would add that many of the organizations have newsletters that are sent out, whether it's monthly, quarterly, during session. You can sign up for some organizations do legislative action alerts. So those are all different ways to get involved. If you are more involved, you can identify who your legislators are, and you can call them, you can email them, you can ask to meet with them, and you can talk to them about particular issues that are of importance to you. Or if you have a lived experience, then you can share that with them and why certain changes need to be made to Maryland law. And so those are all different kinds of things, and different groups amongst that list do trainings regarding legislative advocacy as well. So if you're signed up to get their emails, you might find out about trainings. I did want to touch really briefly on the other two. I do know we're mindful of time, and I want people to have a minute to ask questions if there are any. The other two primary issues that we are working on, one is the nuisance laws and making sure that landlords cannot penalize or restrict a tenant's ability to reach out to emergency services. So there are some places that do have laws and have in leases that say if you summons emergency services more than once in a certain period of time, you're going to be fined or otherwise hold them accountable, try and evict them. Certainly, we know that survivors of trafficking, could be incredibly harmful to them. And we don't want to deter anybody from calling law enforcement if they need it. Or it's generally like an emergency services. So it could be an ambulance, it could be any type of emergency service. And then the other area is looking at education. There are a number of pieces of legislation that have been introduced. I think there were 4 last year that sort of have overlapping themes. And so this might go by way of conversation and policy versus actual legislation, but drawing from those different, seeing if we can draw specific themes. One was surrounding education in schools regarding human trafficking. One was regarding sexting, one was regarding cyberbullying, and then the other required personnel who had training to administer the education. The state does have a health education curriculum, and so the question is, how can we incorporate those important items to ensure that children are being educated at a young age about healthy relationships, about what is okay, about what can happen on the internet, and all of those issues, and make sure that we're doing it young enough in an age appropriate manner, because we know that the age is frighteningly young that children enter, are first brought into the world of, by a trafficker. And so we want to make sure that we are teaching our young people what to look out for and what to do if they find themselves being a victim of that.
Great, thank you for that. I know that we hinted towards kind of having a larger discussion around unintended consequences of anti-trafficking policy, but I think it was definitely more important to kind of get the history of the task force, the current structure, ways for folks to get involved, like Heather prompted us to remember to talk about. And so I do want to invite our speakers back for another webinar to talk more specifically about unintended consequences, along perhaps with some other folks that couldn't make this particular webinar. But I do want to spend the last couple of minutes just kind of talking about introducing kind of a concept or a guide that we'll use in our next webinar around unintended consequences of anti-trafficking legislation. And that's actually something that Professor Bridget Carr from the University of Michigan published a while ago. It's a book called Human Trafficking, Law and Policy. And there is a section on ways to promote better anti-trafficking policy. And she actually has 8 principles of anti-trafficking legislation that I think we can pull some topics from. But the one that I am hearing kind of being woven throughout this discussion, not just about the 3 areas of legislative priority, but something that I've heard kind of weaved in and out of this, one of the ways to promote better anti-trafficking policy is to address root causes or contributing factors, right? And that simply refers to the need to address what contributes to trafficking, what puts people at higher risk of becoming victims. And when I've trained on this, obviously, I talk about, and you referenced, Melanie, in the nuisance law piece, is that, one of the things that can happen when someone becomes a nuisance on their property is they get evicted and they become homeless or unstably housed, and how that is puts someone at tremendously high risk of being trafficked. So from your experience doing this work and your partnerships in your current position or even in your past positions, can you talk a little bit about some of the, the perils of kind of focusing only on anti-trafficking legislation and the ways that we need to consider how increasing people's access to basic services, fighting against the restricting of people's human rights, how all of those things essentially are human trafficking prevention?
Sure. So that's a big question.
Sorry.
We don't have a tremendous amount of time. And I want to give
started.
Amanda a second to say a few words if she wants, but what I'll share is from the domestic violence perspective. For example, a tremendous amount of the dollars are spent on criminalization. But what we know is that when we ask victims and survivors, overwhelmingly, their #1 objective is to be safe. And they need access to safe and affordable housing to be able to achieve that safety. They need somewhere to go. And so we would not be serving victims and survivors well if we're not being responsive to what they are saying that they need. We also do need to look, you mentioned earlier, at the root causes and look at this generally from an anti-oppression lens. And so what policies are there that we can improve? What policies are out there that would make a difference in the lives of everybody, including survivors of trafficking, including survivors of domestic violence, including survivors of sexual assaults? And so just looking through one lane you're gonna miss all of these other opportunities. And having all of the money allocated just primarily, we need all of the responses. For one victim or survivor, the criminal justice system might be where they find their relief. That might be what they are searching for. For another one, it might be the ability to have their record cleared and obtain a job. For another person, it might be having the childcare available and affordable childcare so that they can become employed and can become financially independent. And so if we're going to be trauma informed, if we're going to be victim centered, we need to listen to what we are being told by victims and survivors, and what we are hearing, that areas such as economic justice, areas such as housing, different civil remedies are areas that we should be focusing on from a legislative perspective, and prevention. I mean, I think all of our ultimate goals is that we don't have to have this job anymore. And so going to the goal of primary prevention and looking at education and what meaningful and age appropriate education really is to get us to a point where we don't need these laws, because it's not happening. So Amanda, let me know if anything else you wanted to add.
I mean, I don't know that I can add much to that aside from, there's this place between I remember, okay, let me start here. I remember reading a slide actually by another presenter on trafficking, and the slide was it was just letters, right? It just said human trafficking is all about vulnerability. And that really struck me. And there's this place between victim blaming, right? And wanting to say, let me list all the vulnerabilities that people have to trafficking, and then saying, actually, the cause of, sorry, this construction, but the cause of trafficking is actually the trafficker. And so we need to focus our attention on this perpetrator. And I think that often when we start talking about vulnerabilities, we miss a lot of the conversation around all of these things. What I will say is, when I start thinking about victims and survivors within turnarounds programming, 60 to 70% on a given day live in poverty before they get to us, right? And so how can we start addressing the things that will lead to this person getting into the definition of success for that person? So we start talking about empowerment. I think for me, it's a lot less about vulnerability and how do we define success for that person, so that the walk that we're walking with them will get them to a place in which they can succeed for themselves. Because I think we can keep getting on this wheel in which we are just continuing to there's a lot I could say. Let me just end there. I think the reality is we need to accept that the population, I think to Melanie's point, that we have to think through the way that we're the populations that we serve and how we're addressing these issues on a much more global scale. And I think she's right. These issues are not in single categories. They're much broader than that. So I will echo Melanie.
Yes, we do not live single issue lives. And I think that there's just kind of two things that I want to highlight to close us out. One of the main challenges in doing good anti-trafficking work is that the work is very much rooted in criminalization of traffickers, like you said, Amanda, and not necessarily considering the harm of the criminal legal system, or just the lack of interest in a criminal legal response. But more than that is, I think, the fact that when anti-trafficking policy started, people in power looked like us, right? And they, unfortunately, in a lot of instances, the anti-trafficking field is not the only one guilty of this, but it is people who look like us, who have had, I can say this because I know the three of you, who have lived, fairly privileged lives, making decisions for people who have had experiences they have never had, right? And deciding what is right for someone. And it's really important for the anti-trafficking movement to get out of that lane, because essentially that is really mirroring some of those trafficking dynamics, right? Because when someone is being trafficked, they lack control over or lack meaningful control in a lot of ways over what happens to them. And a lot of times anti-trafficking policy people feel very comfortable saying, well, I'm not the trafficker, but since I'm not the trafficker, it's okay if I tell you what you need. And it's okay if I legislate what it is that I think you need to be successful in your life, right? Or what you need to recover, instead of actually listening to the voices of people who are impacted. And then the last piece is, you both talked about economic empowerment and anti-poverty measures, right? Because the root cause of trafficking is some sort of vulnerability. A lot of times it's the need for money. And I think that we, as an anti-trafficking movement, kind of nationally and globally, we fail to consider that in doing anti-poverty or economic justice work for everyone, we are actually going to ensure that individuals who may become traffickers are less at risk of becoming traffickers if they are able to meet their needs, if they're able to earn a living. In my experience, the real kind of socio or psychopaths are few and far between. And generally, these are individuals who see a way to survive, a way to get ahead, a way to exploit someone to get a leg up in a world that doesn't give them a lot of opportunity, right? Who are stuck in kind of the same issues of vulnerability that victims are. And if we work as anti-trafficking folks to make that world a better place, then we are reducing the risk that someone is going to turn to exploiting someone, as well as the risk that individuals are going to face that put them at higher risk for being exploited. So where we work for the benefit of all marginalized populations, we are doing anti-trafficking prevention at every turn. And so, it's really nice to hear that it sounds like that's been a change, or not a change, a shift in the way that anti-trafficking policy has been looked at in the state of Maryland. And I think that, there's a lot more that we can talk about, and we will kind of leave people on the hook for another webinar to talk more about some of those unintended consequences and the need to do no harm, or the need to do no more harm in crafting anti-trafficking policy. But Heather, I will let you, unless we have questions, take us out with some additional information on the HTPP.
Thank you, Jess. Sorry, my computer froze for a second, which is always exciting at the end of a webinar. I just wanted to say a big thank you again to Amanda, to Melanie, to Jess for giving us what was really a great discussion and a deeper dive into what we're working on, where we've all been, or where many of us have been. Hopefully got people who are not so familiar with the legislative landscape here in Maryland up to speed a little bit and excited about some of the work that's going to be happening during this next legislative session at the beginning of 2023. We will have this webinar recorded and available at our HTPP website. You can see where that's located on the screen here. And we also have a lot of outreach materials, other things associated with this program that you're free to reach out and talk to us about. We love to interact with all of our wonderful community partners and those interested in this issue all throughout the state. This webinar was sponsored by Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service, and we do hold a whole host of different types of trainings and webinars for both pro bono attorneys as well as others throughout Maryland on a variety of different civil legal issues. And so you can learn more about that by visiting our main website as well. Otherwise, just a big, big thank you to our presenters. We so appreciated having you. We look forward to having you back. Sounds like we need to do a part 2 for a deeper dive into some of those unintended consequences. And we will let everyone who joined us today know about when that's going to be coming up. So thank you.